Lessons in Logic video 10, if I'm not mistaken. And in this video, we want to talk about making arguments more easy to evaluate to see whether the premises provide good enough support for their conclusion by making them well-crafted arguments. That's logic textbook language, well-crafted arguments. And here's some other logic language that I'm likely to use a lot in this series, standard form. Well, what I mean here is only that arguments are not always presented in an orderly fashion that allows us to evaluate whether the premises provide good enough support for the conclusion. Now, that's fine in itself. Human beings are not robots, and we shouldn't expect everyone to talk like, I don't know, Spock or something, to say premise 1 and premise 2 and premise 3. And when you use some of the same things in one premise or another premise to never change things out. For example, here's an argument that has some synonymous use of some of the same synonymous use referring to the same categories. All philosophers seek wisdom. Augustine is a philosopher, therefore Augustine is a seeker of wisdom. So in one sentence we say philosophers seek wisdom, in another sentence we say seeker of wisdom. Well, obviously we're using the same concepts here, but we're not using the same language. You can't always expect people to talk using exactly the same language to refer to exactly the same concept every dang time. That's not normal. It's not fun. It's not a fun way of talking. It doesn't make good reading if it's written, and it's just not necessary. But it is necessary to avoid that for logic purposes as such. When you're evaluating an argument to see whether the premises provide good support for the conclusion, you have to do as much as you can to get the argument into a standard form, which means follow the same conventions, and into a very orderly fashion, and, well, make it a little less natural, a little more like Spock or a robot would work with, because they're just looking at pure logic, and that's what you're trying to do in a logic class. Now, it's not enough to just do some paraphrasing. Here is a list of the major things you need to do. And this list is going to actually be almost a process, a set of steps to follow to complete the job of putting an argument into standard form. And it's almost just a list of tips, useful things you should keep in mind, but it's somewhere in between. It's about 70% a list of useful tips, and maybe about 70% a useful process. There being plenty of overlap there because those things overlap. Speaking of overlap, this video will overlap somewhat with the next video. The next video will teach a much better method of doing this. Here we're just introducing the very basics of this. In the next video, we want to show the best method of doing this, at least for purposes of deductive logic, specifically categorical logic and proposition logic, where we want to learn ways of using symbols to represent the smallest components of an argument. In other words, in categorical logic, we break down arguments into their categories, more precisely into the terms that stand for categories, and we want to be able to represent those terms with simple symbols. And in statement logic, we break down an argument into its smallest propositions, and we want to be able, in proposition logic, we break down an argument into its smallest proposition. In statement logic, we break down an argument into its smallest statements, same thing. And we represent those small statements with symbols, and then we are able to represent the argument symbolically so that all we have is symbols. And that means that it's a whole heck of a lot easier to analyze the argument to see whether the premises guarantee their conclusion. So we'll learn the process for doing that in the next video. In this video, let's just look at some of the basics of putting an argument into a standard form or a well-crafted form or into an orderly form so it's easier to evaluate whether the premises provide good support for the conclusion. And here are the steps, the list of useful tips, and almost the process. Here is almost the process for doing this well. First thing first, always, is to identify the conclusion. Identify the conclusion before anything else. And it's useful to look for conclusion indicators like therefore and so, but you don't necessarily want to look for conclusion indicators. In fact, usually it's probably a good idea to just check for them and then make sure you have the right conclusion after you find them, because occasionally the word therefore might be used in a different way and you might get confused by it. or there might not even be any conclusion indicators. Above all, what you're looking for is the proposition supported by the others. That's the conclusion. Similarly, the premises are the propositions that support the conclusion. Premise indicators can be very useful, like I might say, for the reason that, and then give a premise, or here's why, and then give a premise, or because, and then give a premise. Almost every time you see the word because in an argument, it means whatever comes after the word because is a premise. So premise indicators are very useful, but above all, you want to understand the argument. You want to understand whatever you're reading and look for the proposition that's supported by the others. While I say reading, I mean these days, television and YouTube and everything else, podcast, you want to understand whatever you are being told by whatever means, audible or visual, written or not, etc. You want to understand what you are being told and identify the proposition that is supported by the others. That one is the conclusion, the others are the premises. You want to include any unstated steps. Some arguments are enthymemes, and I believe I have a video already in this series explaining that. What I mean by that is that some arguments have an unstated premise, or occasionally an unstated conclusion. Spell out the unstated steps. Also, remove excess verbiage. Now, if it's not already frightfully clear, there's really no way to do all this without rewriting the argument. So maybe I should change a verb here. We encounter arguments in everyday language that aren't well crafted. They aren't very orderly. They don't allow for a convenient examination of whether the premises provide good support for the conclusion. And in order to make them that way, you need to rewrite them in a standard form, put them together, put them together in an orderly fashion. Identify the conclusion first, identify the premises, including the unstated steps, and eventually get it all rewritten, writing the conclusion last. Let's put this in the there we go. Let's write it down in our list of steps. Identify the conclusion first, identify the premises, including the unstated steps, and remove any redundant steps. Remove any, don't list the same premise twice. That means use uniform language. So I'm getting ahead of myself, and now let's rewind and not be ahead of myself. Back to eliminating excess verbiage. What does that mean? Remove the things that are not part of the argument from the argument. Now, there's nothing wrong with including things that are not part of the argument, and sometimes they're very useful. Repetition can be a useful reminder. Repetition can be good for emphasis. Non-uniform language can be good for emphasis, can be good as a helpful reminder. A hedge can be important to indicate that you have some humility. You're not 100% certain of your argument, but a hedge is not technically part of your argument. Now, the hedge is relevant to evaluating arguments in this respect. Sometimes when we evaluate arguments, we don't just evaluate the argument, we evaluate the arguer. We say not just this argument contains a fallacy, but the person who made this argument committed a fallacy. So if we evaluate an argument and we find that the argument is just dreadful, that doesn't mean we get to say the person making the argument is a dreadful person or even is a really dreadful thinker, because maybe some stuff that was not part of the argument indicates that the arguer had some inkling that there was something wrong with the argument, or had enough humility to realize, hey, I could be wrong. And so hedges are important for evaluating arguers, and discounts are important in evaluating arguers, but technically they're not part of the argument. So let me go through this material in a slightly more orderly fashion. Eliminate excess verbiage. Since I started going backwards, I'll keep going backwards. Repetition can be important, but don't repeat anything in an argument unless it's new information, which is to say don't repeat anything at all when you're stating an argument in an orderly fashion, giving an argument in standard form. Remove hedges. A hedge can indicate that an arguer is tentative about something. Remove that. It's not part of the argument. It might have its own purposes, but it's not anything to the purpose of a logic class analysis of an argument. Remove an assurance. The arguer might say, I've been looking into this for years, and I am quite sure of this. Well, that might be relevant, but it's not part of the argument. I mean, I could give you this argument on, this is fun. Confucius has the positive golden rule, not just the negative golden rule. People think Confucius has the negative golden rule, but for the positive golden rule, you have to look to the Bible. Do not do to others what you want them not to do to you. Great, Confucius says that, yeah, but if you want the rule that says do to others as you want them to do to you, well, you have to check the Bible. People say that, it's wrong. I've been looking into it for years. I can assure you Confucius does have the positive golden rule. But that's not really part of my argument, because if I'm really going to tell you that, I'm going to go into some detail. I'm going to pull up the text of Confucius. I'm going to talk about the end of book 6 of the Analects or something like that. So when I pull out the Analects and I look at book 6, the last part of book 6 of the Analects, and I say, here's what Confucius says, therefore, et cetera, therefore Confucius has the positive golden rule and not just the negative. And then I add, I've been looking into this for years. I can assure you this is reliable information. That last bit isn't actually part of the argument. Take it out when you're representing the argument formally. Finally, a discount is an acknowledgement of something that might render the argument weaker or invalid or unsound or incogent or something. There is such a thing as a discount indicator, something like it may appear that such and such, however, blah, blah, blah. If you see language like that, anything that appears after, it may appear that such and such, and well, actually it's the such and such. If you see language like that, anything that appears after words like it may appear that, and before, however, comma, is probably a discount. It's some acknowledgement of some possible vulnerability in the argument, and then setting aside that vulnerability, okay? That setting aside of the vulnerability is rhetorically important. It has its uses. It's important to making a good case in a book or something, or YouTube video, but it's not actually part of the argument. In fact, I think I just did it. I just gave a discount talking about how discounts are important, and then I said they're still not part of the actual argument. Okay, so find the conclusion first, identify the premises, include any unstated steps, eliminate excess verbiage, use uniform language, and write all propositions in standard form. Not all propositions are given in the declarative mood. Now, standard form is going to require a little bit more work when we do categorical logic. Basically, what I mean here is put them all in the same, put them in uniform fashion as much as possible. Now, not only does that mean no repetition when the same material appears in more than one premise of the argument or in the premise and in a conclusion, but also use the same kind of argument, use the same kind of statement form. So don't give all propositions in the declarative mood. Do give all propositions in the declarative mood, for example. Never give a proposition as a rhetorical question when you're representing an argument formally. That's just no good. So let's see. Here's an argument I actually could make, where telling you I've looked into this carefully for years is relevant. I could say, I have looked into it for many years carefully, and I can assure you that Confucius has the positive golden rule and not just the negative. Now, if I tell you that, I might add, can there be any reasonable doubt? Or why would you continue to question that Confucius has the positive golden rule? Let's do it that way. I've been looking into this for years, and I've been looking carefully. I've been studying the text, and I can assure you that Confucius does have the positive golden rule, not just the negative. Do you have any reason to continue to doubt that Confucius has the positive golden rule? No, you do not have any reason to continue to doubt that. Now, in this case, I'm making an argument for my own authority. As someone who studied this, I'm qualified to give a professional opinion. And I'm appealing to my own authority and assuring you that I've been studying it. It's actually part of the argument because this is a different argument, okay? I'm appealing to my own authority. I'm not appealing to the text directly. I would rarely make any argument like this, but it could be done. Okay, so when I do that, you want to put the argument into standard form so you can study it and see how good the argument is. And I gave the conclusion of the argument as a question. Never do that. When you're representing an argument in an orderly fashion to test it for validity, never, ever include a conclusion as a rhetorical question. Put everything in declarative mood and use the same style of sentences and uniform language, and do other things that are part of standard form that we'll talk about in the next unit for categorical logic, and be fair and charitable. As much as possible, try to represent the actual intentions of the arguer. And as a general rule, craft an argument that is harder to refute. It's not good to take an argument that's ambiguous. You know, the argument could be interpreted this way or it could be interpreted that way, and to choose the way that makes the argument weaker and then refute that argument. Now, you should usually represent the argument in the best way. If the argument is to supporting a conclusion you like, then great, you've done a better job representing a stronger argument for your conclusion. And if it's a conclusion you don't like, well, same thing. You want to be able to refute as much as possible the better arguments that are against your own position. You know, you'll be a better arguer that way, a better thinker, hopefully a better human being. Be fair and charitable because it's good, it's right, it's nice, it's kind, but also logically and rhetorically, it's more useful to represent arguments when there's any ambiguity as the stronger version of what they might be rather than the weaker version. Do not confuse sub-conclusions with the final conclusion. A sub-conclusion is a proposition in an argument which is supported by other propositions in the argument, but is itself intended to support the argument's main conclusion. So an argument is a set of statements where one statement is supported by the others. The one supported by all the others is the conclusion, and the others are premises. But sometimes a statement is a premise with respect to an argument's main conclusion, but is itself the conclusion of some other premises in the argument. In other words, arguments sometimes have parts. They have, or you could say arguments sometimes come in chains. There's a word for a chain of categorical syllogisms, but we'll talk about that later in the next unit of this playlist. Let me find a better example. No, let's not find a better example because there's a good example coming up when we scroll down to this argument about Star Trek. Okay, so don't confuse sub-conclusions with the final conclusion, and you may occasionally have a premise indicator or a conclusion indicator for a sub-conclusion. So don't get confused about that. It's actually both. And of course, at the end, you need to rewrite the whole thing and give the conclusion last. And I strongly recommend using numbers for the statements in the argument. And then check your work. Now, let's make this hopefully a little simpler, a little more concrete by doing it. Let's represent this argument in standard form. First, identify the conclusion. Now, I'm going to assume that most or all viewers can read the argument I'm looking at on my screen. I'm hoping I'm zoomed in enough. I hope your screen is clear. I hope the technology is not giving any of us any problems. Here is what appears to be the conclusion. But note how it appears once at the beginning, which is not the way, not the place you want to present your conclusion. Always write the conclusion last when you're putting in a standard form, well-crafted version of an argument. But note that it also appears here at the end. The conclusion is Star Trek is the best sci-fi, and may Star Trek get the credit it deserves as the best sci-fi of our time. Now you might be thinking, which of those is the conclusion? And you might be thinking, they're the same thing. Well, if you want to get technical, I mean, one has a little bit of information the other doesn't have. Actually, each has some information the other doesn't have. The first phrase in Star Trek is the best sci-fi doesn't just say of our time. And the second one says, may Star Trek get the credit it deserves as the best sci-fi of our time, which says something about not only is Star Trek the best sci-fi of our time, but also it should be recognized as such. Technically, that's extra information. So here you just have to make a good judgment. Which of these are you going to use to phrase your conclusion? Or maybe we should say neither. Maybe we should come up with a new way of capturing this information. I think I like this one that just came to my mind. Star Trek should be recognized as the best sci-fi. I think that's a good way of representing our conclusion. Now, what are our premises? We're going to recraft the argument, and we're eliminating excess verbiage. You could think of it this way if you like. We've identified this as the conclusion. Why not color code it? Let's make it red, and we'll make the premises blue. I'm highlighting it now. Oh, still color coding. Now, for excess verbiage, delete. We don't need that. But you don't necessarily want to do all this stuff. I'm just adding some visual reminders that may be useful. The important thing is just how I'm going to write this down in the final version. The rest is just visual illustrations of what we're doing. There are at least 3 reasons for this. Star Trek is the best sci-fi. Our paragraph begins, and the next paragraph of the argument we're evaluating is, no, we're not evaluating it. The argument we're representing in standard form in an orderly fashion, so that we could examine it for how strong it is and whether it provides good support for its conclusion. We're not going to do that. That's for another time. We're just restating the argument in a more orderly fashion. So the paragraph begins, the argument is in paragraph form, not in numbered statement form. And it begins, Star Trek is the best sci-fi, and then it says there are at least 3 reasons for this: philosophy, music, and the best spaceships. And that is useful for keeping track of the information in the whole argument, but delete, don't include, that's not part of the actual argument. That's more excess verbiage. Star Trek has the best philosophy. Now that sure looks to me like a premise. Let's make it blue. Let's highlight. Now, how did I just clicked on the wrong thing, didn't I? Okay, let's highlight that one in blue if the computer decides, oh my goodness. I don't know why my computer is doing this to me. I don't know what it thinks I clicked on. I don't know if I clicked on it. There we go. Oh, that's impossible to read. There we go. So let's highlight the conclusion in red and premises in blue. Star Trek has the best philosophy. So that's a premise. Now we already know to look for 2 other premises. There are 3 reasons for this. One involves philosophy, one involves music, one involves spaceships. Let's find the next one. Star Trek takes philosophy seriously. Well, that's not the same premise we're looking for. We're looking for one about music or spaceships. Star Trek is philosophy in space, which is awesome. Okay, great, great. Next, consider that Star Trek has better sci-fi music. Okay, that looks like a premise about music. Star Trek's opening themes are magnificent, some of the best sci-fi music in history. That's another premise. Well, I don't see anything else about music, except this one. Towards the end of the paragraph where it says Star Trek also has the best music, where clearly we just have excess verbiage. In fact, now that I'm thinking about this, let's look at this whole 2 sentences. These, actually 3 sentences. In short, there are excellent reasons to consider Star Trek the superior sci-fi franchise. These reasons range from the mundane to the profound. Star Trek has the best spaceships, and Star Trek has the best philosophy. In between, you'll find a reason no less important than elegant. Star Trek also has the best music. Delete, none of that's part of the argument. Or it's restatements of some of the argument. We can just ignore it. It's excess verbiage, it's repetition, it's not a new part of the argument. So what is a new part of the argument? Well, we've looked at these statements of the premise about music, but I think it's the same premise. Here again, you just have to make a judgment. You don't want to state both of these as separate premises. You want to give one of them or some statement that captures as much as possible of both of them. So I'm going to suggest this phrasing. Instead of Star Trek has better sci-fi music and Star Trek's opening themes are magnificent, some of the best sci-fi music in history, let's just say Star Trek has really good music, which is also some of the best sci-fi music. So I've condensed these into the same premise, which is really what they are, I think. Now, if you're paying attention, you might have noticed that actually this is 2 propositions. Star Trek has really good music, and Star Trek music is some of the best. If we were doing statement logic in this video, we would definitely split those up into separate statements. Maybe we keep them in the same premise, but we would definitely split them up. There's one statement about Star Trek having really good music and one about Star Trek having some of the best sci-fi music. Or maybe we do this. In fact, now that I think about it, we should totally do this. If Star Trek has some of the best sci-fi music, it's pretty much guaranteed that it's also really good music. Of course, some of the best sci-fi music is going to be really good. So we can just condense it that way. That's fine. Star Trek has some of the best sci-fi music. That's our next premise. Now, what's our other premise? Something about spaceships. Moreover, Star Trek has the best spaceships. And looky there, that's all we've got. So here's our third premise. The original phrasing is pretty good. We are eliminating some excess verbiage. We don't actually need the word moreover and the comma. That's actually not part of the argument. And now, what about this other stuff in between? We say that, well, the argument says the philosophy in Star Wars is a joke, but Star Trek takes philosophy seriously. Star Trek is philosophy in space, which is awesome. Well, it looks to me like what we have here is more premise. Two of them, in fact. One of them is Star Trek takes philosophy seriously. Another is Star Trek is philosophy in space, which is awesome. We could split that up if we wanted to, and we would if we were doing statement logic today, but we're not. Star Trek is philosophy in space. Philosophy in space is awesome. We could have split that up. But Star Trek takes philosophy seriously, and Star Trek is philosophy in space, which is awesome, is a pretty good way of representing these two premises. So now we have this premise, and since it's a premise, let's color it blue. It says this is a premise, Star Trek is philosophy in space, which is awesome. Let's also color it blue. And now, do we have the whole argument properly represented? Well, we're this close. We're so close. Star Trek takes philosophy seriously. Star Trek is philosophy in space, which is awesome. Star Trek has the best philosophy. Star Trek has some of the best sci-fi music. Star Trek has the best spaceships. Therefore, Star Trek should be recognized as the best sci-fi. It looks really good. We're missing one thing. Did you notice what we're missing yet? We've not identified our subconclusion. Now, we have the subconclusion. We've not identified it as such. So here's a premise. Star Trek has the best philosophy. Here's a premise. The philosophy we're leaving out the philosophy in Star Wars as a joke, actually. That's more excess verbiage. Let's format that as stuff we're deleting. Star Trek takes philosophy seriously. Star Trek has the best philosophy. Star Trek is philosophy in space, which is awesome. So one of these statements is supported by the others, but also supports the final conclusion, and it is this one. Star Trek has the best philosophy is a conclusion with respect to the two premises that come before it. Star Trek takes philosophy seriously, and Star Trek is philosophy in space, which is awesome. But it is the premise with respect to the final conclusion. Therefore, Star Trek should be recognized as the best sci-fi. You should label it accordingly. It is recommended that you use the word therefore or the word so for every conclusion and every subconclusion included in that when you restate your argument formally. So here is our argument. Star Trek takes philosophy seriously. Star Trek is philosophy in space, which is awesome. Therefore, Star Trek has the best philosophy. Star Trek has some of the best sci-fi music. Star Trek has the best spaceships. Therefore, Star Trek should be recognized as the best sci-fi. And note that this can sometimes be a useful exercise, identifying what's a premise in parentheses. Note that our first statement is a premise. Our second statement is a premise. Our third statement is both premise and conclusion, and so we can call it a sub-conclusion. And it can also be useful to state where it comes from. Our third statement is a sub-conclusion from premise 1 and premise 2. Our fourth statement is a premise that stands by itself, no sub-premises for it. Fifth statement is a premise. And our final conclusion comes from statement 3, statement 4, and statement 5. Now, one more thing for our visual illustration of what we did, how we got to the original, from the original argument to our well-crafted version of the argument. Let's take that sub-conclusion, and since we are representing premises as blue and conclusions as red, let's hope that looks like purple on your screen. On my screen, it looks like some weird kind of purple. I don't know if beet purple is a commonly used terminology, but I think that would be beet purple if that is a commonly used terminology. It's making me think of beets. All right. Thanks for watching. In the next video, we're going to do this better. We're going to learn a way of making arguments well-crafted, putting them in standard form, and making them extra orderly so that we can examine them to see whether the premises guarantee the conclusion in statement logic and in categorical logic. And frankly, I think that's going to be a better video and a much more useful video than this one, but this was good practice leading up to things. And depending on what sort of class you might be taking, this might be plenty. If you're taking a critical thinking class that's not going to do any categorical logic or statement logic as such, this might be the video you need. But if you're taking a logic class or any class where you're going to cover some categorical logic or some statement logic, you really want to watch the next video. I'm going to shut up and wait till then. Thanks for watching.